A new poll in Russia shows that Russians are tired of war and increasingly supportive of dictator Vladimir Putin's power-wielding course. Loud slogans about victory no longer work. Public opinion is gradually turning toward peace. The Russian sociological Levada Center has published data that is unpleasant for the Kremlin. According to a survey conducted from June the 19th to the 25th, the idea of using nuclear weapons in a war against Ukraine is losing support. If in the fall of 2024, almost half of respondents considered a nuclear strike acceptable, today only 24%. The overwhelming majority, 65%, are sure that even in conditions of escalation, nuclear weapons cannot be used. Those who are critical of the Kremlin's policies are especially opposed to this scenario. Among them, the level of rejection exceeds 70%. At the same time, anxiety about a possible confrontation with NATO is growing. More than half of those surveyed, 56%, fear that further escalation will lead to a direct clash with the alliance. Middle-aged Russians and residents of provincial cities are especially wary. Only a third, 31%, do not share these concerns, mainly pensioners and Muscovites. Another important signal is the steady growth of support for peace talks. This position is shared by 2/3 of Russians, and this figure remains a record for the second month in a row. The desire for peace is especially pronounced among young people, 77%, women, 71%, and those who do not support Putin's policies, 81%. Only 31% are against the settlement, mainly men and residents of the capital. Although official support for Putin's movement remains high, 74%, the dynamics indicate a gradual decline in approval. Already 16% are against the war. This is almost twice as many as at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. General interest in events in Ukraine is also declining. In June, only 53% of Russians followed news about the war, which is significantly lower than last year. Young people, women, and critical citizens are increasingly ignoring the topic, while men, pensioners, and those who get their information from television remain the most involved. All these data point to a growing gap between the Kremlin's aggressive foreign policy rhetoric and the mood inside the country. Mass fatigue, fear of catastrophe, and the desire for stability are forming a new public demand that the Russian authorities are finding it increasingly difficult to ignore.
A strong storm with wind gusts of up to 25 meters per second struck St. Petersburg and the Leningrad region of Russia early Friday, causing floods and power outages in some districts. According to Associated Press, 5 people were injured by falling trees, and 8 cars were damaged, the Russian Emergency Ministry said. The gates of a dam in the Gulf of Finland were shut to prevent flooding in St. Petersburg, the first ever instance of gate closure in summer, according to the Deputy General Director for Dam Operation, Igor Polishchuk. In St. Petersburg's recorded history, there has been only one flood in July, on July 12, 1865. With the dam gates closed, the water level in the Neva River rose to 95 centimeters above the normal level, while the critical threshold is considered to be 160 centimeters. Meteorologists expect the level to rise to approximately 120 centimeters. Nevertheless, a park and a parking lot near one of the beaches were flooded. Local authorities have declared a yellow-level weather alert in effect until July 5.
зимний период мы неоднократно закрывались, а вот чтобы в июле месяце такое действительно в первый раз. Ну и вообще в летний период мы еще ни разу не закрывались для именно предотвращения угрозы наводнений.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin does not care about the losses during the war in Ukraine. However, in 2026, he may have to stop. In an interview with the German publication Der Standard, experts named several reasons that will lead to this. Emily Ferris, a senior fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, a British policy think tank, believes that Putin has failed to achieve his initial aims in Ukraine. One of the UK's best-known Russia experts, Mark Galeotti, believes it is virtually impossible for Ukraine to liberate the occupied territories by military means. At the same time, losses in manpower do not matter to Putin. He views soldiers as living weapons. But the more of them die in Ukraine, the higher the recruitment costs and the greater the pressure on the labor market and the economy, Galeotti said. Judging by population, Putin probably considers the ratio of killed to wounded as a victory. However, if this continues, Russia will eventually have to slow down its offensive actions. He added, experts note that the Russian economy is not as fragile as previously thought. However, pressure on it is growing, which sooner or later may affect Putin's army. In addition, the Russian army will most likely exhaust its Soviet weapons by next year, and new equipment is more expensive. Perhaps by the end of the year, but no later than 2026, a stark choice of guns or butter will arise. The cost of war for ordinary people will increase. The question is when the protests will begin, Galeotti believes. Mark Galeotti believes that the overthrow of Putin and his regime in Russia is unlikely. A coup would be very difficult. After all, the various parts of the security apparatus have been watching each other for a long time. Each of them would ask themselves whether an uprising would be more risky than doing nothing. Galeotti said, Emily Ferris is not sure that the overthrow of Putin will lead to the end of Russia's war in Ukraine. A coup would most likely be accompanied by civil war. In that case, it is difficult to imagine how the war could continue, but an orderly transition would most likely bring to power someone very similar to Putin, who has created a system that reproduces itself, she said. Both Galeotti and Ferris currently see little room for maneuver for the US president. If Putin does not see any victory on the battlefield coming, and at the same time feels that the economic and political situation may become more difficult for him in 6 or 12 months, then he would be interested in a deal. The problem is that there is nothing to indicate that at the moment, Galeotti said. Ferris believes the Kremlin is currently waiting to see what other proposals the White House will make while trying to gain a foothold. In 2026, I can imagine a situation in which a ceasefire would be attractive to Russia. Then they could sit out Trump's term and then try to install a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine through political means, the expert said.